Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here at this sort of very last minute, to have a chance to be among such great friends. It really is a privilege to be with such an amazing movement for change around our food that Food Secure Canada represents and all the groups that are with it. And like many folks here, I was very much looking forward to coming here to not just listen to Idilal and Ibrahim, but also Camilla Moreno. And so it's a shame that she won't be able to speak to us directly about what's happening in Brazil. I've been lucky enough to meet Camilla a number of times at UN meetings and other international conferences. She's a fiery and passionate advocate. And she talks very clearly about some of the geopolitical games that Brazil in particular is playing around agro-energy, biofuels, the state of the workers who work in the sugarcane fields, the impacts on the Amazon. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to talk about those with the stories that she has. But what I can do as a Brit who lives here in Montreal is to give you the bigger picture, hopefully, and then we'll hear some of the more first-hand stories from my colleagues here on the panel. Because where we're seeing all sorts of local and national fights over land, over biomass, as we're going to hear, there's a bigger story behind it, and hopefully we'll begin to touch on what that is. And of course, this is everything to do with food, and in particular, hunger. So if we go back 2 years, in 2008, many of the world's poorest people found themselves in the eye of what they were told was a perfect storm, causing some quite considerable hunger. On the one hand, we saw that food prices were rising at an alarming and incredible rate. They rose about 83% over just 3 years, and pushing about 100 million people into hunger, on top of the 830 million who already are in hunger. And we saw serious unrest around this rising food price crisis. And at the same time, we saw that speculators and others were pushing up not just the price of food, but were also grabbing land. In fact, in October 2008, the NGO Grain uncovered that there was a massive land grab going on in the global south, and that somewhere in the order of about 500 million hectares of land was being grabbed in order to improve the value and produce food for the north and produce money for the north. And in the process, turfing peasants and pastoralists off their ancestral lands. And then, of course, at the same time, we saw this dawning problem of biofuels, which wasn't dawning at all. It just dawned on the world's institutions that this was actually a problem. And we were told that the conversion of corn, of palm oil, of canola, of soy, into ethanol and biodiesel was also a part of pushing up the prices of food, and was also part of the grab that was going on. And that this was providing new reasons for why some of the world's most vulnerable people were being pushed into hunger. And then the financial crisis hit. And with the financial crisis arriving, the international financial crisis, we were told that all of this kind of went away. That through 2009, early 2010, we were told that prices of food had dropped again. Some of the worst land deals had also been dropped. And that ethanol investments had also completely dried up, which is true. Indeed, we saw just this week, actually, Al Gore stand up and admit the ethanol decision was a bad decision, and we've moved past that. It's all over, it's all finished. So then I wonder why, when I open up my email just this week, the things I read are things like a friend telling me that in Zambia she'd just been visiting villagers who'd had their houses burned down in order to grow jatropha in a land grab that was going on in central Zambia. Or why we're learning that just this weekend in Honduras, 6 campesinos were murdered as they were trying to defend land where biofuels were going to be grown. And why is it that the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program is scrambling to try and head off another food price crisis that's going to hit sometime very soon if it hasn't already? And of course, the answer is that far from being a perfect storm that came and went, or a storm in a teacup, what we saw in 2008 was just sort of the first squalls of a much larger change in the weather. And that far from being a little bump, that what we're seeing is the tip of an iceberg. And what we're hopefully going to talk about tonight is that larger iceberg. That the transition that's actually been underway for a little while now, that's making more and more likely even greater hunger, even more significant grabs on the global south, and environmental destruction along with it. And I'm going to talk about one part of that iceberg. I'm going to talk about biofuels to begin with. And those who think that the problem with biofuels was a problem about corn ethanol, that it was a problem that by feeding corn and soy and food to cars rather than people, that was the whole problem, are not really seeing this much larger picture. Because there's a much larger change in the economy that's been underway for about a year now, for about a decade now, sorry, not a year, way more. And the key term for this is the term biomass that we've mentioned tonight. Oh, sorry, can you hear that better? Yeah. Biomass, as Eric mentioned, means the living stuff that the planet grows every year. It's the algae and the plants. All of us here in the room are basically biomass. The world produces about 230 billion tons of biomass every year. And most of that is plant matter. And most of that is cellulose, which is a kind of sugar, which is a carbohydrate. And the theory goes, most of that's carbon. And the theory goes, as we move into a world where it's harder to find carbon, whether to feed cars or to make plastics and so forth, why don't we go for that carbon, the carbon that's locked up in plants, rather than the carbon that's locked up underground? That the reason why the word carbohydrate, which describes plant life in general, and the word hydrocarbon, which describe things like coal and oil and gas, sound very similar, is because they are very similar. That coal and oil and gas are basically fossilized plant matter. And rather than wait millions of years to grab it, why don't we just grab it right now and turn it into the plastics and the fuels and the electricity that we require for our modern lifestyle? And so what we're seeing is the beginning of a grab on that carbon as the carbon below ground becomes too expensive to access or too politically controversial. The above ground green carbon is what industry is increasingly interested in converting into its basic feedstuffs. And the idea is we can run our economy, our existing economies, on the very same principles, the very same production, we just switch the feedstock from black carbon to green carbon. And this goes way beyond ethanol. In fact, ethanol was always never meant to be where it went. That in fact, if you look at what's happening across many sectors of industry, and we're talking about the chemical industry, the electricity production industry, obviously the fuels industry, and other areas, the biggest grab that's currently occurring on this biomass, whether it's forests or it's from fields or it's from deserts or as algae or from the sea, is for electricity. That we're seeing vast quantities of particularly wood and wood chips being mixed with coal in burners to make electricity. And in order to meet so-called renewable energy targets. And that also gives those electricity companies the chance to call themselves renewable and green and carbon neutral, all of which claims that are made for biomass are actually untrue, and I'll come to that in a moment. So this is where we're actually seeing the largest grab on biomass is for electricity, and I think that's very much below the radar. And this biomass electricity production, which is currently responsible for about 52 gigawatts of power worldwide, so that's something like a small developing country's worth of power, is growing and ballooning very quickly. Secondly, we're seeing a switch over to using biomass, whether it's from trees and wood and so forth, or from plants or other sources, in the chemical industry. So we have companies like DuPont, which already claims that 10% of its feedstock is from corn and sugar. In fact, I was kind of curious to find that we were handed cups here that were made by NatureWorks for Cargill. These are made by this is genetically modified corn drenched in pesticides and then turned into plastic. And certainly if we're drinking organic food out of that, it's kind of a curious question why we would do that. But it's a bigger question as well, that if it's